I go, what do I say? Welcome to another edition. Is that what I say? Welcome to another edition of Trail Runner Nation. My name is Don Freeman.
And I'm Scott Warr. And today we have the honor of speaking with the author of Better, Faster, Farther, How Running Changed Everything We Know About Women. This book challenges the long-held beliefs about women in the world of running. Maggie Mertens is here to teach us a little bit about the history of women in running and in sport. And hopefully, as you can see, Don and I are skewed in one direction. We're hoping that we learn a little bit more about women in running and how that can help us in our own running, how it can help us in our community, and how it can help us maybe help women in running as we go forward in this thing. Maggie, thanks for joining us. She's I'm going to start over, Ryan. Maggie is a writer, a journalist, and editor who's based out of Seattle. She writes and reports for a lot of different magazines, including The Atlantic, NPR, Sports Illustrated, ESPN, Glamour, Pacific Standard, Refinery 29, and Creative, and also Creative Nonfiction. Thank you for joining us, Maggie, and for writing this book. It's coming out, going to be published. You can pre-order now, but it's going to be coming out on June 18th of 2024 this year. So thank you for joining us.
And my goodness, Maggie, with those credentials, it makes me ask, why did you join Trail Runner Nation here today? We're honored that you stepped into our world. Thank you.
Oh, well, it's fun. There's so many fun running podcasts, and I've been trying to figure out, why. And it seems that, runners want something to listen to while they're out there. So it's been fun to kind of speak directly.
To give a little bit of perspective on, at least from my perspective in women in running, is if I think back to Bobby Gibb, who was the first woman to run the Boston Marathon when she snuck on the course. That was in 1966. Now, I'm not going to give away my age. You can do the math, but that was only a year before I was born. Don was actually probably walking around when this happened. That is crazy that something like that happened in our lifetimes. And now we look at where we are today, and Maggie's book kind of chronologically explains why and how and how far we've come in that. Maggie, my question for you is, as you were doing research for this book, what are some of the most surprising discoveries you made?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, everything was kind of a surprise. And, as I went into writing, what I wanted to do is take those surprises, take those things that we thought we knew the story, and really figure out what the real story was. Because, like you said, Bobby Gibb's story is one that really did shock me, in large part because, like you said, the generational factor is really not something people think about a lot, I think. My mom was born in 1955, so she grew up at this time period in which, Title IX wasn't a thing yet, and women were literally being told, you are not capable, because of your body, of running a marathon. And in fact, the longest sanctioned race during that time was between 2 miles, and then shortly after it moved to 10 miles. But those are very, very, very short distances when you look at what these women were told, and the reasons that they were told that they were not allowed in these races was truly physiological. So I think one of the biggest surprises for me was that so many of these rules were not just kind of rooted in, I think sometimes we think about gender inequality in sports they just, we're told that it's not proper for women to do these things. But really, they were told, you're not capable of doing those things. And that's a big difference, in terms of just what women had to overcome. And it wasn't just athletes themselves, but, they had to get doctors involved and scientists involved and prove these things wrong.
Well, what a surprise that it was only 1966, and that was here in the United States with the Boston Marathon. But can you give me some perspective on maybe Europe, maybe other parts of the globe? Is there a story there where was the United States in front or behind? What did it look like on the rest of the planet?
Well, I mean, in some ways, very similar, because there was a lot of the same kinds of ideas about gender going through, especially the Western world at the time. But for instance, in 1896, the modern Olympics were revived, right? And they were revived almost exclusively for men. And this was like, this idea was that the Olympics were to promote, masculinity and the male form. And so in fact, they had a marathon in those first Olympics, and a woman wanted to run. And they said, they actually tried to kind of like trick her and say, actually, the women will run the marathon tomorrow, so don't show up at the starting line. And in fact, she ended up running it the following day when she realized that they'd lied to her. And she was capable of doing it. And so when you think that, in 1896, a woman who had never really run before and definitely wasn't training. I mean, men were not even really training for a marathon at that point. It was not a common thing to do. This woman, Stamata Ravithi, was capable of doing it. And so you see that then, that story wasn't really told at the time, right? Like we found this out a little bit later and really just through Greek newspaper reports, things like that. So it was also digging into, how those stories were told. There were certainly women in Europe running and women in the United States running, but they were often held to certain distances and things like that throughout time.
So we speak about running as maybe the point of the spear where it all breaks through, but maybe it's not. Were women accepted in badminton and volleyball and just other things, or was running kind of the first stage where women became competitive? And excuse my ignorance.
No, actually,
I feel comfortable with being the ignorant guy. So
I love it. I think we should all ask the questions we want the answers to. I chose to focus on running in the book because I think it feels like a very human movement, right? I think most people would describe it as a very democratic, low barrier to entry sport, and just form of movement, like taking the sport and the competition out of it, right? And so that's why, I really wanted to look at, okay, what have we been told about women's bodies in this very basic human movement? But like in terms of sport, there were many women who were trying to do all kinds of sports, and often we're told for many various reasons, no, you can't do this. Sometimes it had to do with running, so things like soccer and basketball were kind of like pushed away from women because it seemed too aggressive, too high impact, too much movement. Swimming is actually one of the areas where women early on were more accepted. And that was because that was seen as a very feminine sport, right? And some of that has to do, some scholars think today, with the fact that, women could be seen in bathing suits, and that was something that men would approve of. So there you go. And then you get accepted for that. But those swimmers early on in the 20th century would often complain that they were seen as sex objects and not as athletes, when they were actually doing pretty great work and breaking records and things like that.
There's two of us that are asking questions that our audience may be going, really, you really don't know the answer to that? But I'm thinking if swimming was accepted, I mean, swimming is an endurance sport, depending on how far you're swimming. Were they swimming long distances in back in the day? So if they were, why did they say running was not acceptable, or not acceptable? That's not the right word. Why did they think women couldn't run physically, but yet they could get in water and, perform a long time in the water swimming? Do you know the answer to that?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. And the answer really comes down to the fact that none of these rules really were rooted in reality, right? There was a lot of stereotype at play and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, honestly, it comes down to the fact that certain movements were seen as acceptable for women and unharmful. That was a big, one of the big issues was often, medical professionals who didn't actually know anything about women's bodies, warning that anything that was too impactful for women, too aggressive, would impact women's fertility, would impact, women's femininity. There was a big concern in the early 20th century that women would become too masculine or mannish if they were seen as competing. And, I think we think too today that like running isn't so masculine or isn't so not in comparison to some of the other sports we have like football and things like that. It seems like it's a little more tame these days, but at the time, it was actually considered very masculine. It was like one of these things that we hold on this pedestal, like the Greeks did it. So this is something that of course was like the ideal for men to be able to achieve. And so it is a little bit silly. I think a lot of these rules were a little bit silly when we look back on them, right? That why were we pushing women out of the Boston Marathon in the 60s? It seems silly now, but a lot of it was just rooted in kind of fear around the unknown about really fertility, but also women's place in the world.
I know in all the races that I've been involved with, you don't have to look hard to find a woman's name in front of mine. There's a long list, and so there isn't a line that says this is where women should run and men should run here. There's very, very capable women. Do you think that the male ego got caught up in part of this, not wanting to be shown up or being beaten by a woman? So to solve that, we'll just make sure the women stay at home.
Absolutely. That's actually a great thing to point out. And a lot of different sporting events have dealt with that over time. There have been instances in the Olympics, like I believe in like skeet shooting, one of those kinds of things where a woman was competing with men, won the gold, and then the following Olympics, women weren't allowed. So it's like there's very much like a pattern over time. Yes, yeah. And so now they separate those things by gender, and it's one of the reasons that we separate many sports by gender that don't even really need to be separated by gender. That kind of become a little bit silly again, or even just why we kind of assume that everything is this. The stakes of the competition are so high, right? It's the reason that you can say something amazing about Allison Felix and 500 men on the internet will tell you that, a high school boy can beat Allison Felix. And it's like, well, that's not really the point. The point is like, why can't we just sort of accept human accomplishment for what it is and the beauty that exists therein? And except, like you're saying, Dawn, that there's a hell of a lot of women who are faster than a lot of men on this planet, and that's something that's really cool too.
Right. Do you think, with that same concept in mind, the men's ego was threatened, so they said, you know what we should do? We should make a line between the two and let the women run their race, and we'll run ours, or different categories. Do you think there's ever a time when we might start thinking a little more advanced that would say, I have a choice to enter all racers, men and women, who compete for the same podium, or that we stay separate and have our pink podium and our blue podium afterwards? Do you think we'll be able to compete in a similar with a similar stopwatch?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I will say, in trail running, in ultra distance running, we're seeing a lot of, women hitting the podium ahead of the men. And so I think in some instances, we're kind of already seeing a reason to do something that's a bit more inclusive in that regard. Now, I don't think that will probably be the case for everything, often because our traditions are very strict, and people love sports the way that they are. Also, of course, there are biological differences at the extreme ends that mean that, it's great to have women's sports. It's great to have women's track and field be its own thing. In my mind, we can also think more inclusively and universally, perhaps in what we consider sports and in the different kinds of competition that we hold, and that not everything has to be so strictly binary, when we do see this kind of vast spectrum of humanity.
I think it's amazing, again, back to my opening perspective as I was thinking about this, about 1966, and women not being able to run the Boston Marathon. And just within a couple decades, we see, I think you talk in your book about Jasmine Paris winning the spine race outright. And I went and just off the top of my head, but I needed to fact check some of these things. We look at Courtney Dauwalter, who has 16 outright wins, where she has won men and women. The one that most notably was when Dawn ran the Moab 240. She ran that and won that race by 10 hours in front of the next competitor, who was a man. She won at Big Dog's Backyard Ultra in 2020. And then you look at, even before that, you look at the dominance of Ann Trayson. She was second overall at Leadville back in 1994, which was quite a long time ago. So I think there's been some things we've talked about a little bit on our podcast, where as the running distances get longer, we're seeing that maybe women actually have an advantage biologically and physically. We have a friend that did this history expedition where they talked about the Donner Party and the women and men that made it over the mountains from Donner Lake to the valley. All of the women survived, and there were many of the men that died. So I think that women do possibly have an advantage in endurance sports. What do you think about that, Maggie?
Yeah, we're seeing that. We're definitely seeing that with women like Jasmine Paris, with Courtney Dauwalter. Claire Banwarth is another woman who I spoke with for the book, and who's doing incredible things in distance running, in ultra distance. And there are studies that look into this, and some of the interesting biological things that I found were, studies that showed, of course, there's very varied muscle makeup in men and women, and a lot of that has to do with actually the types of muscle fibers that men and women have, and for most women,
Right.
Have this more muscle fiber that's more the slow twitch, and actually that it enables women to tire less easily. Women can actually outperform men in a lot of ways in terms of muscle fatigue and recovery. And so I think that can play into, right, an ultra distance race. Also, just like the idea of fat storage in the body. And that definitely comes into play during ultra distance, when your body is literally digging into whatever reserves it has. But the one thing that I will say, just in talking to a lot of ultra distance runners who are women, is that it also comes down to this idea that ultras are so much more than one physical task. right? And so it really comes down to also the mental and also like the preparation. How prepared are you? Have you packed all of the things in your drop bags that you need? Do you know exactly like what kind of food you need when, and what's going to give you that pickup? How good are you at sleep deprivation? One of the things that that I talk about in the book is that Jasmine Paris's spine race win was her second child was, I believe, 13 months old at the time, and she'd been nursing her baby every night for a year. And so that gives you a set base of sleep deprivation, right? That you're already kind of there. And so that's going to give you an advantage too. So these ultras, I think, are fascinating for what we can see in terms of advantages women might have, but also just how they do really level the playing field on that gender binary front, because there's so many elements that come in and really like reveal just what human bodies can do that is very amazing, in my opinion.
And really, women's bodies are way more amazing than men's bodies. I mean, they can grow another human inside them and then recover, like you said. Dawn, who was it that we interviewed? This was years ago. I think it was Western States they were running, Western States 100, and they were still nursing. So the husband would bring the baby and meet them at the aid station, and she would nurse the baby while they were at the aid station. You remember who that was?
Yep. You got to give me some time. I know who it is.
You'll remember who it is.
That's right.
But I was just thinking, holy cow, she's putting all of her body's effort at this incredibly hard race. She was an elite runner. She was going for a win, and yet she's still producing, food for a baby that she's nursed. It's just amazing what women's bodies can do. Shame on our culture for saying that women can't do it, because if anybody can, they can.
If I was designing this body, if I was in that space and I had to create a woman and a man, who would I give the most emotional intelligence to, the most determination? Who would I make the best planner? Who would I make to be able to endure the roughest of elements? Because no doubt I gave it away, caring for the kids, right? And making sure that they're able to survive. I would give all of that to the woman. I wouldn't even waste any time giving it to the men. I would fill them up with testosterone, let them be aggressive, let them fight and combat one another and take chances and chase animals. You go out and do that. The other, I would have complete control of everything else. And I think that translates well to ultra running.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's just a lot of very varied variation among humans, and it's a beautiful way to see some of that variation is on these ultra races that bring out, the human at the very extreme of what we can do.
Mm-hmm. And I've said before, if you want to learn who you really are, spend a lot of time alone with yourself doing something hard. You'll reach in, you'll discover your strengths, you'll identify some weaknesses that you need to work on. But there's a moment in life that people do a lot of things, but doing something hard, whether it's rock climbing or kayaking or trail running, do something hard where you have to reach in and reach deep. You'll discover what's at the bottom of that human bag of yours. There's a lot there.
Yeah, and that actually brings up for me too, one of the big ideas in the book is that, for so long, if women were being told that they weren't able to do those things, right? They weren't able to do hard physical things, and were being actively kept out of some of these hard physical things that men were doing and being lauded for. That really has an effect mentally too, right? Like just on what our own expectations are for ourselves, and whether we can do certain jobs in the workforce or study certain things in school, and so those are really important mental gains that we've made too.
Maggie, I'm curious, You said that your mother was born in 55. Is that what you said?
Yep.
So as you were growing up with her having this understanding or perception in her mind that women can't do this, can't do that, did you feel that there were limitations from your parents that were put on you growing up?
That's a great question. I think the opposite. I was born in 87, so I was really in the girls sports boom of the United States. I was raised to play soccer and do track and do cross country and play t-ball and, do all of the things. I also grew up with 4 brothers. So I was very surrounded by sports and activity, physical activity. And I think my mom having been raised in a time when, there were no school sports, she wasn't ever really encouraged to do, physical things. I think that also raised this generation of women to question what they were told, right? To say, oh, well, we were told all of this, but now these girls are all, being given these opportunities and they're doing great, and Bobby Gibb and Catherine Switzer and all of those women and Joan Benoit who showed us that, all of this stuff is possible. I think it really created this environment for that generation of women to push their children, their daughters especially, to take all of those opportunities and to see what we could do and to see what we're capable of. And I'm really grateful for that experience. And I feel like, just being, not even any kind of elite athlete by any means, but just having the opportunity to play and to run and to see what I was physically capable of has been a real gift for me in terms of, feeling like I'm on equal footing with other people in the world.
Yeah, and I think your mom deserves some credit for instilling that, planting that seed in your head, because she didn't limit you or hold you back. She said, yes, go out there and beat those people, and that's nice to have that kind of support from home. So good job, Mom.
Absolutely.
Maggie,
job,
do you think Maggie, do you think now we're sitting in 2024 that we're still chained? When I say we, I mean women's sport is still chained. I mean, we see Caitlin Clark and the success that she had this year for women's basketball, and in trail and ultra running, we're huge fans of the women that are just making amazing accomplishments. Do you think that we still have some lingering bias or unfounded ideas about women's sports?
Yes, we do. I think there's still lots of improvement to make. From the way that we pay women athletes, which is still, far less in most cases, to also just the attention, the marketing, the investment in a lot of women's leagues. But that is real. You are right. We're in a really great moment right now. Like, we are seeing, just in the past 10 years since I started writing about women's sports, I've seen so much improvement. Like, it's been a pretty incredible experience to witness. And yet, I still to this day, if I write a story, pointing out some inequality, there are many, 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 many humans on the internet usually that, want to point out these biological differences and inferiority and that the WNBA doesn't deserve equal pay because they don't bring in as much money. And so there's just this, there is a lot of lingering sense, but, I think that's another part of the reason that I wrote the book, is to look at, okay, this is a long history of myth making and stereotype that we're fighting against right now, and looking at, what we have right now and really how we can build it and how we can encourage it. And truly, I mean, I am a big fan of the WNBA. I go to my Seattle Storm games regularly, and I just love seeing how the audience has changed there in recent years. And I love seeing all of the men that go to the games now, and the dads bringing their kids and their sons and their daughters. And I think that's just so huge and so beautiful. And just in speaking to, young kids now too, the way that Caitlin Clark was really embraced. I mean, that's a beautiful story that someone, that a young girl in college who has this immense talent was able to be seen by the media and by, young people and older people alike, that she was just, yes, as a talent, and period. That's it. Like, just to see her talent. I think that was, that's been a huge step for women's sports.
Yeah, but the comment that goes along with it that I think needs to be changed, and then correct me if I'm wrong. I think she was only paid first year salary of $75,000. I mean, that's not enough for a world class athlete that's changing a sport to say, yeah, come play with us for $75,000. I mean, people, working in your local town, first year on the job, make that.
Yeah. And then that's exactly what I mean by there's a lot of work to be done still. And that also just speaks to how we value as a public, how we value women athletes and how we value women's contributions. And those contributions are consistently undervalued in all industries, right? And in sports especially.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of historical reason for that. There's been a lot of really incredible barrier breaking women's basketball players over the last 25 years who have been paid not very much at all. As for their salaries. And, I'm really glad that that's getting attention now. But I will say, we're at a moment too where I think that will shift soon, because Caitlin Clark is the first generation of girls to grow up thinking that was a possibility, to know that she could be a professional basketball player, right? And so again, it comes back to that mentality and what we're told when we're growing up, right? So, okay, she's going to put everything she has into this. Of course, she's going to be great. Of course, this generation is going to change the game even further. Because 20 years ago, those women played basketball for fun, didn't think that, it would go anywhere. Of course, the game is getting better.
I'm curious, and I have no idea whether this is the case or not, but I would say I probably know as many women runners as I know men runners. When we're talking elite runners, and I'm curious whether they're making the same amount of money on the running side. So if a pro athlete gets a Solomon contract, is the woman paid the same or less than a man that gets the same Solomon contract? Do you know that, Maggie?
I don't know it off the top of my head, but if I had to make a guess, I would say probably there's still some discrepancy. Only basing that on the fact that, it was not that long ago that Nike got in so much trouble for their professional running contracts being so discriminatory against their women athletes, and some of the complaints in those athletes who were finally speaking out about the maternity protections and things like that would also mention, the pay, and that, we just don't necessarily hold them to the same equity when we're first coming up with these business contracts and league contracts and things like that. And so, if you're allowed to pay a woman less, why not do it?
Right. You mentioned just briefly earlier about Title IX. What is your viewpoint of Title IX? Was that a good program? Is it still a good program? Has it helped women's sports?
And tell us exactly what Title IX is, because it wasn't many years back, Scott, that Sally Edwards mentioned Title IX, and we looked at each other and she said, "You guys don't know what Title IX is?" So maybe there's somebody like us. So Title IX, Maggie, give us a sentence on that.
Yeah, Title IX is an interesting thing. It was actually part of a law that was signed by Richard Nixon, and it's called Title IX because it's actually part of a group of laws called these Higher Education Amendments. So it was actually not really about sports at all when it was signed into law. Part of the reason for it was at that time, kind of during this time of Bobby Gibbs sneaking into the marathon and things like that, it was perfectly legal to not allow women into college, into medical school. It was perfectly legal to just say, no, you can't. We only have room for 5 women in this class. And, and so you're above our quota. And to fire women from jobs for becoming pregnant, things like that, or getting married. Those were all legal things to do up until this point. And so this was signed into law in 1972, and it said that in terms of education that was publicly funded, there could not be any discrimination on the basis of sex. And so that really changed things. It was a really great thing overall, and it has made huge impact just in terms of our educational system, in terms of our economy, what jobs are open for women, etc. But the thing that they weren't quite thinking about was the fact that in America, sports are extremely tied to our educational system. And the way that most people get involved in sports is through school. And that was the case then. But back in the 70s and the 60s, sports were almost exclusively for boys. And so there were no real school sports for girls. And if there were, they were, very underfunded. They probably didn't have real coaches. They probably didn't have uniforms, etc. So this changed things a lot. It didn't go into effect immediately. And some would say, that most schools in the country still aren't really in compliance with Title IX, given, the fact that most schools do end up funding and paying more attention to boys football teams, for instance, than maybe a girls soccer team or a girls basketball team, or a girls cross country team, which I think is probably towards the bottom at most schools. And so, yeah, Title IX was a huge shift in terms of just giving that sort of legal push ahead of changing some of society's overarching thoughts, right? So sometimes you kind of need that push before we change the minds of the people. And I think that was one of those laws that really did shift it. In fact, Bobby Gibb, as an interesting side note, wanted to be a doctor. She did her undergrad as a pre-med student, and she was denied her entrance to medical school, and they told her it was because she was too pretty and she would distract the boys in the lab.
Oh, geez. Oh, goodness gracious.
Yeah.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm curious, in your research, did you find any, so most of our history and the stuff that I read in your book was based on Western civilization, whether it was, European history, Olympics, Greece, and all that. Were there other societies, or are there other societies that may be more of a matriarchal based society or culture that didn't have to deal with this, that they didn't put limits on women? And what can we learn if that's the case?
I mean, there have been matriarchal cultures throughout history in humanity. I think the thing that makes this hard is that sports in the way that we run them today is very Western, and so does really come from this Western world. So perhaps there were cultures where, women were being more physical, being more allowed to take on some of these roles that maybe we would have thought of as more masculine, but maybe they most likely didn't have organized sports or things like that, so that we can't quite see exactly. And I think that's one of those things too, where, we think we know all the stories of humanity, and we love to, talk about nature and biology as being so set. And, there was man the hunter, and women stayed home with the babies, and that's just how humanity began. And we really don't know that at all. And actually most ancient historians now and anthropologists will say that, in fact, there has been humans have been around for so long, we've probably had countless forms of society and countless matriarchies and things like that, wherein we really don't know where how the gender roles differed and how that probably have impacted bodies and things like that over time.
And I'm gonna mention this, Maggie, and you certainly don't have to answer this, because it would be tough to all of a sudden join in on a podcast and then have to speak to Title 9, Title 9, and then a comment about the animal kingdom. I mean, that's a long ways to go. And it's been a while since I watched Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, and that was back before Title 9.
Maggie doesn't even know what that is.
That's
She's too young to know what that show was.
So it's about this guy, and he went out and looked at, and Jim was his partner. It's a good story. Look it up. And there are some animals that are out there that it is a matriarch community, where the female is the leader or the boss, and the male's the gopher guy. Oh, I'm not talking about gophers. It may be. Can you cut all this out, Ryan? So, and I think it's tigers or lions or something, that the female is the leader. It's been a while since I watched that episode. I have to go back to it. It's in the 70s.
Yeah, lions.
Lion. Yeah, thanks. Good.
Yeah, no, they're the hunters, actually. The female lions are the hunters. The men just kind of lays around and wait for them to bring it back. Yeah, so we assume, right, that
they're good for nothing.
The way they are. Yeah. They're scary, I guess.
So there was a lot of wisdom in my comment. Yeah, a lot of wisdom there. Yes. Even a blind squirrel gets a nut sometimes. Yeah, that was me, just talking about stuff. What's up next, Scott? Give her a good question.
As we were talking about this, it just I don't know why I didn't think of this before we started the podcast, but another great book that we read that is related to this. Now we're of course trying to have you guys all go out and get the Better, Faster, Farther book because it's an excellent read. It has a lot of really good history. But there's another book by Lauren Fleshman. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Maggie. It's called Good for a Girl, A Woman Running in a Man's World. And it's a shorter book. It's more of a personal experience that Lauren had. And it opened my eyes to the inequality. So going in, reading your book, I think maybe Don and I had a little bit of an advantage because we read this other book. We're trying to get the author on to talk about it, but it didn't happen. But I was surprised from a man's point of view, my point of view, how much inequality there was and how poorly the women are treated and continue to be treated very unfairly. And so I'm glad that these books are coming out, and I'm glad that we're learning from our mistakes. So I want to say kudos to you for bringing this stuff up. And this one that you wrote has a lot more history, fascinating stories that you bring up in this book.
Yeah, Lauren's great. Her book is a really important moment for women runners, I think, everywhere, and women athletes, and it's a great it's a great example of just using your own voice, right? And why these stories do matter. Right. Yeah, and that's one of the things I really wanted in this book was to tell some of those stories of the women that have come before that didn't get their stories told at the time.
So Maggie, if you had a crystal ball, and I don't know if you do, and I can't see below your shoulder, so you may have one there at the desk, where do you see women's sports and what's happening? That we've looked back, we've seen things, but can you project what's waiting for us?
I wish I could. I mean, I think we are, like we mentioned before, we're in a moment where I think we are kind of finally starting to change the perception societally, right? I think we are seeing some shifts in just how we perceive gender and what those strengths might be that come with women and women athletes and what they're bringing to sports, to running, to these games. And being able to just see them for what they are and see their accomplishments for what they are. So I do think that we're going to start seeing hopefully a bit more attention, hopefully a bit more respect, and just really trying to start to question those stereotypes and hopefully hear them a little less often just in society at large.
And I think so too. One of the things, as we've talked to, I just lost her name. Hang on.
Is it the same one that was breastfeeding?
No, I got it. As we've talked to Dr. Megan Roche before, I mean, elite runner herself. Her husband's an elite runner, and she, I can't remember what her PhD is in, but it's women's. Something with medical, and she explained to us that most all of the research and studies, medical research that have been done, even today, are based on men, and men were the subject of all of these medical studies. We haven't studied the women, and I think that that's something that is slowly changing. I think it's definitely needed, but I think that's one area that we need to get to. Women's bodies change way more than men's bodies, I think, going through puberty and that sort of thing.
And pregnancy.
I want to mention, and pregnancy. I want to mention, not only does Maggie have a lot of great content in this book, but such a phenomenal writer, and strategically, I love the way that you set up the chapters in this book. If you don't mind, I want to read some of the chapter headings, because the chapter headings evolve as women in sports have evolved, right? So chapter 1 is, it starts out, women can't run. That's the introduction. Women can't run. And then chapter 1, but not more than 100 meters. Chapter 2, but only white women. And then chapter 3, but not a mile. Chapter 4, but definitely not a marathon. Chapter 5, but only if you train like a man. Chapter 6, but only real women. And chapter 7, what about the long run? And so I love the way that you structured the book, showing the evolution of women in running along with the chapters. I just thought it was brilliant. I love the chapter headings.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it was one of those things where I was really like, okay, what am I talking about in each of these? And it really turned out to work as the actual name of the chapter, right? Was, okay, what's this? What were they being told at this point, and what did they have to prove wrong?
Well, a great book for any young lady that's out there, putting her shoes on and running to hear some of the history and some of the opportunity that lies in front. And I think it's going to be a powerful message. And, we talked with Dr. Rob Bell about hinge points, about something that exists that may change everything moving forward. And I think your book and contributions like this are the hinge point for a generation. So I think it's a remarkable thing you've done.
Oh, thank you so much, John. That's very sweet.
And I'm going to add, this book isn't, from my perspective, every man that has a sister or a daughter needs to read this book. And they absolutely need to read the book because they need to know the history so that we can change the future. You can write that quote down later, Don.
Yeah, you know what? I should have said, Scott, you're right. I blew it when I said a young woman. It should be by anybody. And if you know a woman, then you should get the book. Man, that was probably better stated.
Yeah. The book is available for pre-order right now wherever you go. The audiobook has been recorded. We just talked to Maggie before we hit record. She actually recorded the book, and so it's her voice. So if you've enjoyed her lovely, energetic, comical voice, it's a very pleasant voice. You'll love getting the audible version. Go out and run, and you can listen to the book and learn more about women in running. So, Maggie, thanks for this great book. Where could we learn more about you and your writing and everything about you?
Oh, well, yeah, definitely order the book. I'm most active on Instagram these days. That's Maggie J. Mertens is my screen name there. And my website is maggiemertens.com.
Maggie, thank you so much for joining us on this virtual run today as we talked about your book. And we hope that you go out there and run.
Mas.
There you go.